In Tokyo, the radio broadcast jubilant words. Ribbons were tied to shop fronts. Newspapers printed maps showing a far-flung empire that, for a moment in June 1942, seemed to have the initiative. Behind the celebrations, aboard the battleship Yamato, where combined fleet staff worked and slept, reports arrived that could not be swallowed by propaganda. The public read triumph. The bureaucrats, the admirals, and their aides read numbers. 4 fleet carriers gone. Hundreds of veteran airmen lost. The difference between what a nation told itself and what its commanders now had to reckon with would become the fulcrum on which the Pacific War turned. The question that haunted Japan's naval leadership in the months that followed was not simply how to replace men and machines that had been sunk at Midway. The question, the darker one that turned up again and again in diaries, staff notes, and the fragmented minutes of meetings, was this: how fast could the United States replace carriers and pilots, and could Japan possibly match that tempo? What, when the smoke cleared from a tactical encounter, would be the strategic arithmetic of sustained industrial mobilization on the other side of the ocean? The immediate facts were stark. In June 1942, the combined fleet had lost 4 of its fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The losses were more than tonnage. Carrier warfare was about aircraft and air crews. Japan lost hundreds of veteran pilots whose experience could not be quickly recreated. Public communiques in Tokyo framed Midway in ways that would soothe the shaken population. Internally, however, the combined fleet and the Navy Ministry began to tally what those losses meant for the future contests. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor operation, and a man who had been unusually candid about the limits of Japan's industrial base before the war, had long warned that a protracted contest of attrition against the United States would be perilous. His warnings now had a new, urgent meaning. Even before Midway, Yamamoto had been aware of the sheer scale of the American industrial potential. His pre-war notes and later staff minutes show a consistent thread. He regarded the U.S. as a nation capable of extraordinary production if mobilized, and he feared that Japan could not keep pace indefinitely. Those were not marginal musings. They shaped Japan's strategic calculus. But assessments and political realities do not always line up. After June 1942, the combined fleet had to assume the role of integrating hard facts into strategy. The first of those hard facts to arrive came not from a battle, but from beyond the front lines, from shipyards. Throughout late summer 1942, intelligence reports trickled into Tokyo from a variety of sources: intercepted shipping manifests, observation notes from neutral ports, and what naval attachés could glean from industrial chatter in cities such as Newport News, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia. The reports were initially parsed with the assumptions of a navy that had long measured warship construction the traditional way: a keel laid, months or years of fitting out, trials, and commissioning. Japanese staff officers, accustomed to fleet carriers taking 3 to 4 years to be built in peacetime, traded early indications of new American programs with those same expectations. That assumption would prove dangerous. The Essex-class carrier program appeared on paper as a significant expansion of American carrier strength. Japanese analysts noted the program and its laydown dates, but they also brought to those entries the working assumption that ships of that size would take 3 to 4 years to appear in the fleet. That assumption was not frivolous. Historically, big fleet carriers were complex machines that required long lead times. Yet by late 1942 and into 1943, what the records began to show was not a one-off anomaly, but a systematic difference in American production methods. The U.S. yards, pushed by an economy retooled for total war, had adopted modular construction techniques and around-the-clock shifts that compressed traditional timelines. Modular construction, in concise terms, meant that sections of a hull and superstructure could be prefabricated in parallel and then brought together for final assembly. Rather than a single slipway where a ship was built almost sequentially from keel to funnel, U.S. yards orchestrated production like an assembly line. Components, systems, and sections were built at the same time and then assembled. The effect was to shave months, even years, from what would otherwise be expected build times. For naval officers trained to judge enemy capacity by older standards, the modular approach created a cognitive blind spot. The commissioning of USS Essex on December 31, 1942, was a watershed moment, and it arrived faster than many in Japan had planned for. Essex was not merely a new hull. She was the signal that American industrial methods could produce fleet carriers on an 18 to 20-month timeline, from keel laying to commissioning. That compressed timeline was not an isolated event. After Essex, more hulls followed in rhythm. By mid-1944, U.S. fleet strength in carriers would look fundamentally different than it had at the end of 1942. The numbers arriving in combined fleet files meant the hypothesis Japan had been operating under, that a replacement carrier would take years, not months, had to be revised urgently. Operational evidence on the sea reinforced the new picture. From the bloody shores of Guadalcanal in August 1942 through the carrier duels at Santa Cruz in October 1942, American carriers and carrier air groups showed a willingness to operate and to return despite setbacks. The Guadalcanal landings on August 7, 1942, and the subsequent months tested both navies' ability to sustain operations far from home. The U.S. Navy, even after losses and torpedo hits, the USS Saratoga was torpedoed on August 31, 1942, and put out of action for a time, continued to rotate carriers, repair, and return them to action. At Santa Cruz, on October 26, 1942, the Americans lost the USS Hornet and suffered grievous aircraft losses, but their capacity to field and replace striking forces became clearer. Ugaki Mate, a persistent diarist within the Navy staff, put notes into his journal that reflected a growing unease. The Americans continued to appear again and again with replacements in the field. Those diary entries, catalogued among other staff notes and letters, would later be read as a record of mounting anxiety. Japanese assessments were not uniform. Records are fragmentary in places, some meeting minutes are incomplete, and private discussions were rarely recorded verbatim. Still, what survives shows a pattern. The Navy Ministry and Combined Fleet began compiling reports that compared attrition rates, pilot training throughput, and shipbuilding projections. In these documents, a troubling arithmetic appeared. Japanese naval aviation had relied heavily on seasoned carrier pilots whose pre-war training and early war combat had made them particularly effective. But attrition at Midway and on the Solomons front removed a disproportionate share of that experience. Training programs were compressed. Experienced instructors were often sent back to the line. New pilots were rushed to replace losses, but could not, in kind, reproduce the tacit knowledge of veterans. Across the ocean, American training pipelines had been expanded. The U.S. Navy, benefiting from a vastly larger industrial base and a society mobilized for total war, could recruit, train, and equip air crews at an accelerating rate. Training programs were systematized, and a wide pool of reserve manpower, industrial standardization in aircraft production, and practice in shore-based combined arms operations meant attrition was less fatal to the overall force structure. The Japanese staff recognized the disparity. Even with brave and skillful pilots, the tempo at which Japan could create operationally effective carrier air groups could not keep pace with the United States if that nation continued to pump hulls and airframes out of its yards. War games and simulated scenarios at Combined Fleet headquarters began to reflect this emerging reality. Through much of 1943, despite the island campaigns that still favored local initiative and tactical skill, staff officers repeatedly ran projections that did not favor Japan. The surviving records show wargame outputs and simulation notes that, with chilling consistency, projected an overwhelming U.S. carrier superiority by the middle of 1944 if American production trends continued. These scenarios were not dramatic creations meant for propaganda. They were the statistical and operational assessments produced by the staff, build rates, projected commissioning schedules, and assumptions about pilot training yield, feeding a single steady conclusion. The more conservative of these exercises still pointed to an imbalance that Japan could not close without a political and industrial transformation that, in the short term, Tokyo seemed unwilling or unable to undertake. As those wargame scenarios accumulated on desks in the Navy Ministry, two structural realities compounded Japan's difficulties. First, the training pipeline for pilots in Japan was shortened drastically under wartime pressure. Where pre-war training had measured months and demanded many flight hours under varied conditions, wartime exigencies forced the curriculum to be compressed. Instructors and veterans were lost to combat demands, and the flow of replacement pilots could not replicate experience overnight. Second, Japan's industrial base, from steel production to the shipyard capacity to the number of cranes and the fuel necessary to keep foundries running, was intrinsically smaller than that of the United States. Where U.S. yards could retool and expand, leveraging a national mobilization and the benefits of economies of scale, Japanese yards operated under tighter constraints of material, manpower, and strategic reach. In staff memoranda and in the diaries of officers such as Ugaki, there is a recurring rhetorical turn toward inevitability. The language is cautious, qualified by the fragmentary nature of the record and by a culture that often avoided theatrical admissions of failure, yet the arithmetic speaks plainly. If the U.S. could commission a fleet carrier in under 2 years and sustain a robust pilot training throughput, by mid-1944, the combined fleet would face a numerical disadvantage it could not outfight. Those memos and diary pages were not intended for public consumption, but they would later be used by historians as evidence that within Japan's naval bureaucracy, the seeds of strategic defeat were already visible. Between late 1942 and 1943, the U.S. commissionings continued. Essex was not an anomaly. She was the first of many. The American shipbuilding program kept its pace through 1943, aided by modular techniques and by the industrial mobilization that made factories hum day and night. Ships that once would have taken 3 to 4 years to appear on the water now emerged in 18 to 20 months. To a Navy that had expected a slower replacement rate, each new commissioned carrier was a small strategic shock. To be precise, the Japanese staff initially held to their traditional expectations, and only as more hulls appeared earlier than forecast did that conservative calculus shift. The change was not instantaneous. It crept into the top-level estimates through repeated evidence, a commissioned hull here, operational squadrons reported there, and the appearance of repaired ships returning to action sooner than assumed. Operationally, 1943 was a year where the U.S. began to demonstrate sustainable carrier presence in multiple theaters. The Solomons Campaign, fighting around Guadalcanal and nearby islands, was a grinding contest that tested supply lines and air cover. Even when individual American carriers were damaged or withdrawn, replacements were rotated in. The pattern was noticeable enough that notes in combined fleet files called attention to the Americans' ability to sustain an extended presence. The Japanese Navy could win tactical victories and in several engagements did inflict damage or force withdrawals. But winning a tactical skirmish was no longer tantamount to shaping the strategic balance. On March 31, 1944, Admiral Koga Minichi, who had succeeded Yamato after his death on April 18, 1943, died in a plane crash while returning from inspection, another blow to a Navy coping with attrition at the very top. Leadership turnover was in itself not decisive, yet the loss of officers who carried institutional knowledge made it harder to pivot to the industrial realities becoming evident in the files. As 1944 approached, those files contained a steady drumbeat, U.S. carriers multiplying on paper and at sea, training pipelines swelling, and Japanese aircraft numbers and experienced crews dwindling. June 1944 produced the strategic climax that many of the war games had predicted. The Marianas Campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th were not the only decisive moments of the Pacific War, but they were where the emerging balance of force became painfully visible in combat. The Japanese fleet attempted to contest the U.S. advance to the Marianas. What happened over those 2 days was catastrophic in both material and human terms for Japan. In the skies above the Philippine Sea, American aviators benefiting from superior numbers, radar-aided early warning, and improved tactics decimated Japanese carrier air attacks in what contemporaries and later historians called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese strike waves launched from carriers were intercepted and annihilated before they could press home. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were lost in the air and at sea. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carriers suffered critical blows. The newly commissioned carrier Taiho was hit by a torpedo. Records show the deadly damage and subsequent catastrophic loss of the ship. And the carrier Shokaku, too, was sunk by a U.S. submarine during the action. These losses were not merely the sinking of hulls. They represented the collapse of platforms essential to air power projection and the further reduction in a pool of experienced pilots who could not be rapidly replaced. June 1944 produced the strategic climax that many of the war games had predicted. The Marianas Campaign and the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th were not the only decisive moments of the Pacific War, but they were where the emerging balance of force became painfully visible in combat. The Japanese fleet attempted to contest the U.S. advance to the Marianas. What happened over those 2 days was catastrophic in both material and human terms for Japan. In the skies above the Philippine Sea, American aviators benefiting from superior numbers, radar-aided early warning, and improved tactics decimated Japanese carrier air attacks in what contemporaries and later historians called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese strike waves launched from carriers were intercepted and annihilated before they could press home. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were lost in the air and at sea. On June 19, 1944, Japanese carriers suffered critical blows. The newly commissioned carrier Taiho was hit by a torpedo. Records show the deadly damage and subsequent catastrophic loss of the ship. And the carrier Shokaku, too, was sunk by a U.S. submarine during the action. These losses were not merely the sinking of hulls. They represented the collapse of platforms essential to air power projection and the further reduction in a pool of experienced pilots who could not be rapidly replaced.
The silence that followed within Navy ministry corridors after reports from the battle arrived was not theatrical. It was the pause of staff officers absorbing a calculation that their earlier scenarios had forecast with unsettling accuracy. There are, in the archive, staff reports and ministry memoranda that catalog these events and attempt to place them into the longer-term picture. A recurring theme in those documents is a painful admission. The tactical picture and the strategic outcome were diverging. Fields of operation where Japan could still exert influence were shrinking, even as American resources expanded. The phrase that later historians found in the margins of these files, that Japan lost this war in 1942 when we believed we had won it, must be handled with care. It appears in the record more as an assessment attributed to a staff officer in retrospective files and should be treated as such, a summation drawn by those tasked with explaining how an early assumption about the opponent's capacity had produced a long-term strategic failure. It is not in the surviving archival record an oratorical proclamation by any single high official broadcast to the nation. Rather, it is the distilled judgment of staff-level analysis recorded in ministry files and diaries. By misreading the pace and scale of American industrial mobilization after Midway, Japan had walked, slowly and with intelligence blind spots, into a strategic trap. Understanding how such an error could take hold requires attention to a mix of institutional, cultural, and logistical causes. First, pre-war doctrines and peacetime expectations create cognitive inertia. The Japanese naval establishment had long metrics and patterns for assessing warship construction and pilot replacement. Second, wartime censorship, the need to maintain morale, and the political reluctance to signal weakness meant that public narratives were not the same as internal estimates. Third, the American industrial system was not only larger, but differently organized. Modular construction, mass production of aircraft by multiple manufacturers, and an educational system producing trained technicians all fed into a much quicker operational replacement cycle. Taken together, these factors produced the arithmetic that staff officers in Tokyo began to write down with growing alarm. The human cost threaded through every page of those files. The loss of veteran pilots, men who had accumulated experience in takeoffs and landings under fire, in leadership of squadrons, in the split-second decision-making that makes carrier aviation effective, could not be tallied simply as numbers. Diaries and marginal notes from the combined fleet speak to the strain felt in squadrons as replacements arrived with fewer hours and less exposure to carrier conditions. Ships lost crew complements and specialized technicians that took years to develop. Each sinking and each aircrew lost had a multiplier effect on training pipelines and unit cohesion. When the Philippine Sea battle crushed a large portion of Japan's remaining carrier air strength, it did so against a backdrop already colored by the attrition of men and the inability to replace them in quality and quantity. The final months and years of the war would see Japanese carriers used in increasingly desperate fashions. As the material gap widened and as shipping lanes were attrited by American submarines and air power, some remaining carriers were employed as decoys or as part of ad hoc formations that could not hope to recreate the pre-war force levels. Records from late 1944 and 1945 reveal an admission, often unstated but visible in operational orders and deployment patterns. Japan no longer had the resources to project the kind of carrier force that could reverse the strategic momentum. The combined fleet's earlier worst-case simulations, which had seemed perhaps overly pessimistic in the aftermath of Midway, had in many instances tracked the trajectory of events. Reflecting on these documents, the lesson that emerges is structural rather than moral. Modern naval power, in the age of industrial warfare, is not merely the product of brilliant tactics or isolated victories. It is the product of sustained capacity, of factories that can build hulls and aircraft at scale, of training programs that can produce and refresh skilled personnel, of logistics that can keep fleets fueled and supplied. Japan fought bravely and often skillfully. Many local and tactical contests were fought with valor and competence. Yet strategic victory in a war whose principal variable was industrial output proved to be decided in the shipyards and in production lines as much as on the decks of carriers. When Combined Fleet staff officers and Navy ministry analysts looked back in 1944 and 1945, the phrase that kept surfacing in their files and diaries was not a cry of self-flagellation, but an accounting of error. The nation's leaders had allowed a tactical picture to be conflated with strategic reality. Midway, when analyzed only as a tactical set of outcomes, had been celebrated. When the losses of men, aircraft, and carrier hulls were viewed over time against the unseen counter of American shipbuilding and pilot training, a more somber verdict emerged. The internal assessments, carefully recorded across fragmented minutes, diaries like that of Ugaki, and ministry reports, converge on this judgment. The strategic consequences of Midway were not what public jubilation assumed. By the time the Essex-class program had produced multiple operational hulls, and by the time the Philippine Sea battle had decimated Japan's carrier air arm, the earlier misreading of U.S. industrial tempo had revealed itself as decisive. This is not a narrative that frees any single officer of responsibility, nor does it reduce the war to inevitability devoid of human choice.
Decisions were made at many levels. Political orders constrained military options. The loss of Yamato in April 1943 removed a voice who had been unusually candid about the limits Japan faced, and Koga's death in March 1944 further drained the Navy of senior figures attempting to navigate an increasingly difficult strategic course. Yet the central explanatory thread in the surviving records is stubbornly systemic. A mismatch between production capacity and expectation, a mismeasurement of how quickly an adversary could recover, and a failure to adapt strategic plans swiftly enough to the changing industrial realities. The final archival echo of those months and years is a bitter clarity. Staff officers, poring over shipbuilding rates and pilot rosters, mapped the route from Midway to the Marianas and saw that one was the cause of the other by virtue of misperception. Records are careful to mark when documents are fragmentary, when minutes are incomplete, and when diaries speak in shorthand rather than full explanation. Even allowing for those gaps, the pattern is unmistakable. Tactical outcomes had been allowed to harden into a narrative of triumph, and that narrative obscured the arithmetic of production. The consequence of that obscuring was not received immediately at the front, but emergingly, inexorably, in the form of more and more American carriers at sea. For students of strategy, there is a lesson sewn into those pages that is blunt and modern at once. Winning a battle can be the prelude to losing a war if the victors misread the opponent's ability to replenish and exploit resources. Industrial mobilization, as the Combined Fleet's post-facto assessments showed, is often the decisive variable in wars fought across oceans and involving complex equipment and trained human labor.
The Japanese staff's repeated, increasingly stark wargame outputs between 1942 and 1944 illustrate the cost of underestimating that variable. When historians today read the diaries of Ugaki or the Navy Ministry memoranda that quietly conclude Japan's miscalculation, they see a bureaucracy slowly coming to terms with an inconvenient arithmetic. That arithmetic was, by misunderstanding how fast American carriers could be built and how rapidly American pilot training could expand, Japan allowed a moment of tactical pride to calcify into a strategic blunder. The assessment written into those files that the war's outcome was in effect preconditioned by a misreading that began in 1942 is not a slogan, but a sober accounting. It is a judgment built from shipyard logs, commissioning dates, pilot rosters, and the careful, sometimes halting notes of officers who were trying to reconcile what the newspapers said with what their charts and reports showed. The story centers on the moment of internal realization because that is where the war's deeper meaning was recorded.
Not in the loud proclamations, but in the quiet margins, in diary entries noting concern, in fragmented meeting records recording the new tonnates on order and the unexpected speed of American refits, in the war games that repeatedly ended poorly for Japan. These are the papers that answered the title's central question: what did Japanese command say when the United States struck back? The answer emerges as a chorus of cautious statements, of staff-level assessments and diary notations, of a sober recognition that industrial mobilization had shifted the strategic balance in ways that few had fully anticipated when Midway's smoke cleared. For viewers and those who study the period, the broader takeaway is clear and not merely historical. In industrial age warfare, a nation's capacity to sustain and replenish forces can matter as much as the skill of its commanders on the day of battle. Tactical brilliance can win engagements. Strategic sustainability wins wars. The combined fleet's record, its war games, its diary pages, its ministry files, testifies to that lesson with a painful clarity. When the naval staff finally put the arithmetic together, their assessment was a summary, not an epiphany. By misjudging the opponent's industrial tempo after Midway, Japan set into motion a chain of events that would culminate at battles like the Philippine Sea. The staff officer's concluding assessment recorded in Navy ministry files that the pivotal mistake had been made in 1942 when a tactical outcome was mistaken for strategic advantage, remains one of the most consequential judgments to emerge from the war's internal papers. If this kind of evidence-based deep dive into the industrial and operational undercurrents of World War II is the kind of history you value, consider liking and subscribing for more. The documents, shipyard logs, diary extracts, and ministry memoranda that form the backbone of this narrative are linked in the description below for anyone who wishes to read them directly. The lesson from these records is straightforward, though sobering. Wars are not decided solely by single battles. They are decided by the capacity to sustain fleets, to train replacements, and to honestly appraise the enemy's ability to do the same. In the quiet margins of the combined fleet's files, that realization was quietly written down, a strategic judgment whose implications the Japanese Navy would feel with increasing force from 1943 into 1944 and beyond.